long year. I miss you guys. I'm glad you guys decided to attend this, and thank you for being here. So I wanted to use my time, and normally this is the CTO update, but rather than give you kind of the list of things that I'm thinking about, I wanted to kind of share with you the lens that I'm looking at the world through. So a large part of my role here at IntelliSecure in my role just as a professional is trying to understand where the world is going and look 3 to 5 years out with respect to security. And I think one of the things that this year has taught us is the ability to be flexible and agile is more important than ever, and that change is going to happen, and major disruptions are likely to become part of our life for the foreseeable future. So when I talk to business leaders, which is a big part of what I do to try and anticipate where security is going to go, they introduced me to this concept called VUCA, which is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous times. And they kind of shared with me some of the things that they do to navigate through those times as business leaders. And it really resonated with me because as a security person, I need to also be able to be flexible and move with the business, because ultimately what we're here to do is secure the business. So I just wanted to take a little bit of time to share the concept of VUCA with you, as well as share with you the conversations that I've had with business leaders about how I would build a security program in order to be modular and flexible enough to work inside that world. And I think that'll give you a window into the way that I'm thinking about our offerings here at IntelliSecure and some of the things that we're considering. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about new products or vendors that we're considering, although if you look at the agenda, you'll get a glimpse into what we're thinking about. Rayhan Jalal will be with us this afternoon, which I'm very proud to present. Rayhan founded Elastica, which became Symantec's CASB, and he's doing some really cool things around privacy compliance, and he'll be there, or he'll be with us a little bit later. Also, Dave Cole from OpenRaven, who I've introduced some of you to solve specific problems, is someone who's doing interesting things that we're looking at and considering. But for the purpose of my 30 minutes with you guys today, I'm going to share this concept real high level. I'm going to go through what VUCA means and how it impacts business. Then I'm going to give you my security recommendations for how you can address that. If you think that this is something that's going to impact you and your organization, what can you do about it? And then last, I'll wrap up with the high level, what can we do right now? So first of all, what is VUCA? So VUCA is a term that comes from the U.S. Army War College. It was designed to describe the world after the Cold War and the fall of the Soviet Union. So prior to the fall of the Soviet Union, and a lot of you remember this, but I'll just share with everyone who doesn't or hasn't really thought about geopolitical dynamics with respect to the Cold War. You essentially had two sides. You had the United States and democracy on one side and their allies in Western Europe and all over the world. And then you had the Soviet Union and communism on the other side and their allies. And really, every country, essentially, with the exception of people like Switzerland who never aligned with one side or the other, but for the most part, every country kind of picked a side, and you could anticipate threats and changes in the world based on which side people were aligned with. And it was a relatively straightforward world. When I joined the Army in 2001, we were navigating a very different adversarial environment. We're really talking about asymmetrical multilateral threats. Threats could come from anywhere. A good example was the equipment, Cold War equipment, with respect to the military, was designed where all the armor was in front. You were pointed at the enemy was in a line, you knew where they were. It was relatively easy to defend against. And then after the Cold War, we had to retrofit all of our technology to be able to address attacks from anywhere. And in a large way, that's kind of what's happened to security as well. When we were in a data center, it was very similar to the graphic on the left. You could see, you kind of knew what your territory was, and anything outside, you had to not trust it, and it had to prove itself before you let it into your territory, and you kind of knew where to go. The world we live in now looks a whole lot more like the world on the right, where our data is going everywhere. It's being shared with lots of different people external to our organization, and we need to understand it differently in order to protect it. And so the real concept behind VUCA really resonated with me, and it's also something that's used to characterize the current business environment. And the real key to VUCA is being agile, right? You're not going to know where the attack's going to come from. Your static defenses aren't necessarily going to protect you. So how do you build in the agility to respond to all the inputs around you and make good decisions? The other thing that's a common thing that we talk about with business leaders when we talk about VUCA is change. And ultimately, change has become something that's always accelerating. It's always with us. And that's the quote from Ray Kurzweil. He says, "We're entering an age of acceleration. The models underlying society at every level, which are largely based on linear models of change, are going to have to be redefined. Organizations are going to have to redefine themselves at a faster and faster pace." And it's really about how quickly can you change, how quickly can you adapt. And then we have the graph here in terms of human adaptability and technology. And Mike, we might need to mute all lines. So when we have the curve of human adaptability and how quickly we can respond to change, and then we have technology that accelerates change at a rate that is faster than that which we can respond, then we get into this kind of stressful position where we're trying to meet the challenges around us faster than we're necessarily able to adapt or able to move our organizations. And I think that's where a lot of us are right now, and that leads to the frustration that a lot of people feel with respect to all the changes. So think about the security landscape over the last 24 months. You had Symantec, which was probably the most stable security company for a long time. It was the safe company to choose, being acquired and just massively changed. And then we had the pandemic where people started working from home and everything that we were doing in the past got disrupted. And we don't necessarily know what the future looks like for the next 12, 18, 24, 36 months. And all of those things require us to think differently about what we're doing. And that thought process is really changing the way we think about security and the way we think about our business. So I was going to open this up at this point, but I'll just put this question up, and if you guys have thoughts, I'd love to hear them as we wrap up. But how has the pace challenged security teams in your organization, and do you feel pressure from accelerating business change? And as I talk to different business leaders, many of them are facing the types of changes I'm describing. Some are not, and that's okay. Some business models are less disrupted than others in this space. But I think what 2020 has taught us, even if your business wasn't as directly impacted as others, is that we need to be prepared for unforeseen circumstances, and how can we quickly react and change what we're doing in order to get there. Which leads us to change, and why is change so hard? And I really like the graphic on the right. He asks first, who wants change, and everyone raises their hand, and then says, who wants to change, and no one raises their hand, and he says, who wants to lead the change, and everyone disappears. And I think that's part of what we see. People will say that they want change, but they don't necessarily want to change what they're doing, and they certainly don't want to help everyone else change. There's a reason for that, and it goes back to neuroscience, and ultimately our brain is wired to resist change because it's perceived as a threat, and it's unknown, and it raises our defenses. So it's not that people are resistant to change because they don't want to rationally. It's because all of their evolution and they're hardwired to resist that change. And it's things like fear and loss of control and more work, and change saturation is a big one. People feel like they've had to change so much, they just don't know if they can do it again. And part of that challenge, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, we did a session on change management, organizational change management, which I thought was very good and had some core key concepts. But part of the reason why organizations struggle to adapt, and this was actually shared with me by the leader of a cable company, he said part of the reason why people are so reticent to adapt is this idea that change is to take you from one point of equilibrium to another, right? It's to take you, so we're going to do this thing, and when we're done, everything's going to go back to this new normal. And what he said is, because of the pace of change, there is no equilibrium, there is no new normal, and we have to think about change differently. The change is constant, and we need to take a change leadership approach instead of a change management approach. And what is the difference between change leadership and change management? Change leadership more reflects building an agile organization where change is the constant, where we're constantly reevaluating what we're doing and making minor adjustments rather than building this large plan to make one major change and go back to a stasis. And I thought that was really interesting because if organizations are behaving that way on the business side, then we need to start thinking that way on the security side as well, which means we're constantly in a state of reading and reacting and trying to establish what we should do next rather than constantly trying to say, all right, we're in this one state now, and if we're going to change, we need a long-term plan to do that, and we need to make a big change all at once. What we're seeing now is we need to be able to manage much more frequent, smaller changes in order to stay ahead of where we are. And there's really 3 steps for that. First, we have to establish a clear direction and priorities. What are we trying to accomplish? The second, we need to achieve alignment and accountability. So people need to understand their role in that change and what they need to do, or that role in that new normal, or whatever you want to call it, and build commitment and engagement. So really, this is from a business context, but I think it's applicable to security as well. So last piece I'll share with you about VUCA before I get into what that means for security from my perspective, and how you're going to see IntelliSecure respond to the stimulus that we're looking at. And I said stimulus on purpose because I didn't want to say change, because again, when we talk about VUCA, it's really about reacting to external stimuli and constantly. So what do we see? I mean, there's some pictures on the right. Some companies you may recognize. I think the picture on the top left is probably the most striking to me. You have, a tribes person in Africa on a cell phone, right? That's not something that you would have seen even 5 or 10 years ago. So it's kind of interesting to just see the pace of change and how rapidly things are changing. The little kid on the bottom right reminds me a lot of my son. It's out of the cradle and onto the smartphone is where a lot of these kids are, and they're connected to the world. And that's the world that we're living in, a world that's more connected and changing faster than it ever has. And so what does it look like inside our organizations? Well, a lot of times there's an intense pace, huge intensity. Everyone's connected all the time, the 24/7 on culture, heightened complexity. We have to constantly be changing, reacting to disruption. And a lot of this stuff really stresses people out and makes it difficult. And then ultimately, this is the quote from the executive I was talking to at the cable company, verbatim, and I'll share these slides later if you're interested in what he had to say. But it was really about, we're not going to ever be at equilibrium again. And we need to accept that and be prepared to deal with that reality, not only with respect to the pandemic, but with respect to the next disruption that we don't know what it is. And how that's going to impact our business. And there will constantly be these disruptions, and change is the new normal, and it's going to be perpetual, and we need to be prepared for it. Okay, so a lot about VUCA. If you guys are interested, I've got a lot more on that if you ever want to talk about it. It's fascinating to me looking at the state of perpetual change and what that does to people, and the neuroscience behind it, and how it works, and how we can better prepare our teams to adapt. But I just don't have that kind of time to do a neuroscience deep dive as much as I'd like to. I'm sure Stephen is smiling somewhere and laughing at me for being a nerd, but it's okay. All right, so uncertainty is the new normal. So how do we adjust to an ever-changing situation where the new normal is indefinite uncertainty? So how do we do that from a security perspective? Well, there's a couple of things that we can do. And a lot of this is things we've been saying for a while. And the thing about IntelliSecure, where I feel most fortunate, is a lot of the things that we've been talking about and we've been doing have become more relevant in the new world. I'd be a lot less excited to be part of a company where the change is making them more obsolete and less relevant. But for us, we feel that we need to step up into that void and show people ways that they can build a change-proof or future-proof plan. So the first thing I would say in an uncertain situation is focus on what matters most, define it and value it. There'll always be new technology to buy. The truth of the matter is, I put it up there that most of it will be a poor investment. It doesn't mean that technology is inherently bad. It just means that a lot of times The technologies that are being developed to solve a niche problem aren't necessarily the best investment. A lot of times, a better investment is focusing on your programs. So we need to define our most critical assets. We've been doing that for a long time. We need to identify risks against those assets and define a risk treatment plan. Those risks can constantly change, but the assets may not change as quickly. They may change, but they may not change as quickly. And by focusing on the things that we universally are responsible for and the things that we universally control, which I'll touch on in my session tomorrow, then we have the ability to build a program that doesn't necessarily behave differently, at least at its foundational level, when we're in SaaS or PaaS or IaaS or on-prem or any combination of those things. So whenever we're dealing with those things, it's important for us to be able to have a flexible program that has foundational elements. So that's number one. Focus on what matters most. Number two, build protections around what you have control over regardless of what changes. So again, understanding what are the things that I'm going to control regardless of where the workload or the data sits. And building my controls, my foundational controls around those. Doesn't mean I can't augment them with things that I may control in some situations and not control in others. A great example of this is next generation firewall or endpoint. Doesn't mean I throw all those things away. If I have control over the network segment, great, let's exert that control and put additional controls there. But understanding that I won't have control over every network segment, that can't be the baseline of what I'm trying to accomplish. Endpoint is kind of the same thing. Unless I'm going to block access from devices I don't own, my endpoint protection platform is certainly something I should do for devices I do own, but I have to understand that there will be devices I don't own that may be accessing my information and my workloads, and I need to make sure that I'm not relying on a protection that isn't there all of the time. And then classify controls into partial controls and comprehensive controls. And that's, again, part of what I was talking about in the last piece is not every control is going to be there for you all of the time. And that doesn't mean that you don't deploy it. It just means you have to understand that and build that into your program. Partial controls are perimeter controls, network controls, endpoint controls. Again, doesn't mean that they're not important. I'm not trying to say that you shouldn't have those controls, just to say that those controls aren't going to be applicable to every workload, every transaction, every share of data. Permanent controls, persistent rights management, identity and access management, and controls on the repositories that house sensitive information. You're always going to control those things to some degree. You may need third-party technology to do that, but whether I'm in PaaS or IaaS or SaaS, any of those cloud environments, I'm always responsible for my data and my identity and access management. No third party is going to take responsibility of that for you in those environments. So it's important that you understand that you can control those things universally. And if I design my program from the data I want to protect out, very quickly getting to identity and points of presence, then I have universal control over what happens to that data. So how do I build a modular program? And again, this is going back to another history lesson. For those of you who know me, I like to relate the concepts I'm talking about and thinking about to historical context. And one of the major advancements in human history was replaceable parts. So before replaceable parts, if you bought a weapon or you bought a vehicle, it wasn't really vehicles back then, but you bought a good, it was a finished good. And if a piece of it broke, you had to buy a whole new one. Replaceable parts said that we're going to have different parts that we can interchange. And if a piece of it breaks, then we can just buy that piece, replace it, and move on. It led to a lot of innovations in the automotive industry and weapons manufacturing, lots of other things. But that's the same way I think of security programs. If I build it as one big monolithic thing, then when one thing changes, I have to re-architect the entire program. If I can build it modularly, then if something changes, I can re-architect what changed. And what does that look like for me? Well, it starts with the critical asset protection program. And in this context, it's probably broader than what we do as a critical asset protection program, but there's nothing to stop you from taking what we've built and broadening it out to be kind of an umbrella for all of your security program. And the reason I think it makes a really good umbrella is ultimately information security is about protecting information. It's right there in the name. And so what are we trying to protect? What is our objective? And understanding that objective clearly and defining it for the entirety of the security program is an important first step. The next layer around that is I need to put some disciplines around that. And security right now exists from me inside these 4 disciplines. And people can talk about this differently and break this into different categories, but this is really where I see it. You have the data protection discipline, which includes things like DLP and data classification, those kinds of things. Some of what you'll see later, privacy solutions like what Rayhan's built. Network and cloud security discipline, which is really about everything from your next generation firewalls, your IDS, IPSs, all of your traditional on-prem stuff, as well as your CASBs and your cloud security posture management platforms and those kinds of things. Your identity and access discipline, so you need to be able to control who can access what and when. So this is things like your Oktas, your pings, your SailPoints, your CyberArks, all these other technologies that exist in that identity space. Your endpoint security discipline, because as long as you're issuing machines, you have a fiduciary duty to protect those machines. Maybe not fiduciary, but you have a duty to protect those machines that you're issuing and make sure they're not endangering your environment. And your SIM/SOAR discipline or analytics discipline, whatever it is that you run your SOC on. So all of these different disciplines are in this under this critical asset protection program, because ultimately we should be unifying our what we're trying to accomplish across these disciplines. And ultimately, what I would then do is design a program for each discipline and say, all right, we have our critical asset protection program, which is our higher arching, this is what we're trying to accomplish. And then we have each of these disciplines, and each of these disciplines should have a program. And that program should encompass all the technologies in those disciplines. And to the extent that we can, we should be integrating across technologies in these disciplines to build a comprehensive capability. And then the last layer is the individual technologies. And the reason it's important for this is you can see that if let's say, DLP becomes irrelevant in the future, we can take this out and something else replaces it, and we can swap out this part. But what we're trying to accomplish from a program design perspective, which flows up to what we're trying to accomplish from a critical asset protection program, doesn't necessarily change. And you could say the same for any other technology, or as different changes in the business put pressure on the way that we do things, we can swap out individual capabilities without having to swap out entire programs. So just a quick introduction. I'm going to give you my top 3 takeaways, and then I'll have a few minutes for questions if you guys have questions. I'm very excited about the agenda, excited for you guys to hear from Skylar, and Skylar and Kyle's session tomorrow should be very informative. Excited for you guys to meet Rayhan, and I really want your feedback on what he's built. It's something that we're considering whether we should get involved in or not. From a privacy, GDPR, CCPA perspective. So I would love to hear feedback from the group after you hear from Rayhan. And then I will see you guys again tomorrow to talk about Zero Trust and SASE. But my 3 takeaways from this: evaluate your security program, understand if it's architected from the inside out or the outside in. Build a program starting with what you're trying to protect, and try and value that. What is it worth? The truth of the matter is, for some organizations, it's already happening. For others, it's a matter of time. There will eventually be downward pressure on security spending, and we will have to justify our investment. So trying to understand now, what is this worth? What is the mitigation of this risk worth to the organization is probably important, so that you can make good decisions with respect to how we're spending money. And if there is downward pressure on our budgets, we can either defend that budget, or we can decide which investments we want to make and which investments are no longer as important to us. And then the third for me is build a modular program and an agile operating rhythm, so you can adjust quickly when things change. We are living in a state of perpetual change. I do not think that's going to stop, both for IntelliSecure. So you'll see us continue to look at our offerings and think critically about what we're doing, as well as for our clients. So that's it for my prepared comments. I'm going to stop the share. If anyone has questions, I would love to hear from you.
Okay, thanks. Hi, Jeremy. It's Ahmed. The challenge that some of us face in our security world is, how do you articulate what you just presented to a C-suite? No offense to any C-suite members here, but it's to understand that in depth, the wider business focus C-suite.
Yeah, I think speaking to them in the terms that they're speaking in do help. This VUCA concept is pretty in vogue in business leadership circles. So being able to talk about that, it's been in a lot of Harvard Business Review articles lately. It's taught at the business schools. It's something that they're more familiar with. So trying to find what is the language that they're using to talk about perpetual change in the change environment and adapt your security program language to the language that they use tends to resonate a lot better than us using security jargon and them using business jargon and talking past each other. So I've found a lot of power in being able to articulate concepts in the terms that they use to talk about them and then adapting what we're suggesting to those concepts, if that makes sense. That's one of the reasons why I shared VUCA with you guys, because when I talk to business leaders, they understand that concept. And so when I then apply that to security, things that they didn't understand before, that become more readily apparent to them.
Okay, thanks, Jim.
Yeah, no problem. Skylar, you want to grill me in front of the group?
Absolutely. So really the only question I had is that really if people are fearful of change and they're looking for a new normal, but you're saying that we'll never achieve that new normal, then how do you propose that you then allow change to be something that's a positive reinforcement as opposed to a negative that helps people constantly understand the flexibility of being able to change to the adapting, whatever the issue is, be it security, be it, work, be it whatever that issue may be in the future?
Yeah, I mean, you're really hitting on where a lot of business leaders are going to make their money over the next 5 to 10 years, is being able to effectively manage change and build a culture where change leadership is inherent in the culture. And a lot of business leaders are trying to figure out how to do that. I don't necessarily have all the answers. What I would say is setting expectations is the first piece. And the second piece of change leadership is establishing a clear North Star or why. So if you look internally to IntelliSecure, Stephen does that for us. He makes sure that we're all aligned on what we're trying to accomplish, why we're trying to accomplish those things, and then the what underneath all of that may constantly be disrupted. The other thing is trying to build an organization where change is part of the culture. And part of that is this idea of agile organizations and how do we make it so that when we need to change, we can do it quickly, and it feels like a challenge and an opportunity rather than a threat. So some of it is that positive framing and reinforcement, building that culture of innovation, making it a safe place where to try ideas that maybe don't work out, fail fast, all those kinds of cliches. But ultimately, that's the challenge for business leaders moving into the future, is how do we prepare people for perpetual change when people are hardwired naturally, to no fault of their own, to fear it. And that's the challenge for business leaders for the next generation, I think.
Awesome, thank you.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Is there any or comments from anyone in the audience?
Hey, this is Tony. I have a question. Jeremy, you mentioned making sure your data protection program is not, that it's designed from inside out, not outside in. Do you mind maybe giving some examples of those two design, I guess, directions, and contrast them so that maybe a more of a practical way of self-analysis, I guess.
Yeah, a great question, Tony. And really what I'm referring to is a model that I didn't put on the screen, but I've shared before, and I'm happy to talk you through it. But essentially, the outside of the model are things like your perimeter, your network, your endpoint. And then in the inside of the model are things like your data, your identity and access management, those kinds of things. And so outside in says we're going to first focus on where the data is, a place or a network, and we're going to lock down that perimeter, then we're going to lock down that network, then we're going to lock down that endpoint. And eventually we may start to consider what the data is that we're trying to protect. Inside out says, I'm going to look at the data. I'm going to figure out where it is first. I'm going to protect it everywhere it exists. I'm going to manage who has access to that data, what they can do with it first. And then if there are concentrations of that data in places like specific cloud applications or specific networks, then I will look at those individual places and lock those down last. So it's whether we're focused on the locations and securing the location and just putting whatever data in that location, or focused on the data that's most important and securing it wherever it exists. That's the difference between the inside out and outside in. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy.
Yeah, no problem. And we can sit down and talk about what that actually means in practice if you want. We can spend some time.
I'm just scrolling through real quick to see if any other hands have been raised. Tony, you get a gold star for leveraging the technology there.
Nice. We love
Okay,
gold
great.
stars.
So again, just to keep on track and allow these sessions to move forward, if you have additional questions or comments, you can always submit those via the chat function at the bottom, and we'll follow up with you. Two quick housekeeping things as we transition to the next session. People are coming in and out of the sessions. That's one of the nice things about doing this virtually is if there's some sessions that are more interesting to you, you can come in for those and leave. Just as a reminder, anybody in the sessions, please mute yourself if you're not engaging in the conversation. That's one thing. Second thing is for the benefit of everybody participating, if you can please announce your name and maybe your role in your company when you have questions, that will allow the audience to understand kind of the perspective of where your question is coming from. Because there's many of you that are in the same industries. And this is one of the challenges of doing this virtually is not being able to sit across from each other during the breaks while you're grabbing a coffee or a refreshment, having that side conversation about the topic or the subject that we're reviewing. So by announcing yourself, it does allow for some connection, and ideally we can facilitate connections after this event. So as an example, Tony's question, there may be somebody else that says, you know, hey, I'd like to talk to Tony or follow up with him directly on something. That by announcing yourself, it'll help facilitate that. So we would appreciate that.